When we think about the civil rights movement in the United States, most people immediately think of Martin Luther King Jr., and almost everyone can recite the beginning of his "I Have a Dream" speech. But the story of another human rights activist, Malcolm X, is often censored in history class. He is misunderstood as someone who preached hate and violence against white people, and some believe that if young people watched his speeches, it could actually be rather dangerous. Because of that, his memory is often swept under the rug. While everyone knows him by name, not enough people know the true story of Malcolm X. He was one of the most influential Americans who ever lived, and his legacy still echoes on to this very day. Without him, the US and maybe even the entire world would be a really different place. In today's Biographics, we're going to talk about the incredible life of Malcolm X. A boy named Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He was one of 7 children belonging to Louise and Earl Little. Malcolm's parents taught their children all about the history of slavery and the importance of rising above their circumstances. Malcolm and his siblings, they were all extremely well behaved, even from a young age, because they knew that they were trying to represent their race in a positive light. His father, Earl, believes in the teachings of a man called Marcus Garvey, a black nationalist leader who preached that African Americans should be self-sufficient when it came to running their own farms and their own businesses. Earl was a Baptist minister who pushed for desegregation between white and black people. Because of this, their family received death threats from the KKK on a daily basis, so they were constantly moving just to stay alive. In 1929, Earl Little bought his family a 4-acre farm in Lansing, Michigan, which had a very good neighborhood with great schools. The only issue was that they were the only black family in town. Now, hate isn't something that children are born with, so Malcolm's classmates in kindergarten treated him just like everyone else. Malcolm's favorite game was Robin Hood, and he always invited his friends over to run through the fields and the forests of his family farm, pretending to steal from the rich and give to the poor. Eventually, the racist members of the community, they caught wind of this black family living a comfortable middle-class life, and well, he didn't like it. The neighbors complained, saying that black people should not be allowed to own so much land. Even though there was no law saying that they couldn't live there, the local council voted on the issue and agreed that the Little family had to move. Earl Little refused to leave, saying that his family had every right to stay there. Lansing, Michigan was home to an offshoot of the KKK called the Black Legion. Instead of wearing silly white robes with pointed hoods, they dressed up in even sillier pirate costumes. You really couldn't make these things up. One night, the Little family awoke to an explosion as these white supremacists hurled bombs at their house. Earl and Louise had to wake up the children and get them to safety. Despite the explosions, which could certainly be heard for miles, local firefighters, they never showed up to help, and the house, it burned to the ground. In the morning, Earl Little confronted the local police. He accused them of being members of the Black Legion. The police responded by arresting him for arson, saying that he burned down the house to receive an insurance settlement. The charges, though, they were later dropped. Even after this, they refused to leave because they wanted to be an example of the black family who stood their ground and didn't give up without a fight. Unfortunately, their strength and resolve was not enough to convince the citizens of Lansing that they were worthy of living there. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, Earl's body was found crushed on the tracks of a streetcar. The coroner ruled it an accident. The police said that he committed suicide. In his autobiography, Malcolm X explained that his father had sustained injuries not consistent with a streetcar accident. Despite the coroner's statement, the insurance company that held Earl Little's policy refused to pay Louise due to their contention that Earl's death was a suicide. Malcolm's mother had a very difficult time raising her 8 children alone. She sold many of their belongings and would sew for people in town in order to make an income. She rented their land to other local farmers, but there was never enough money to go around. She was a proud woman, though. She lived by her principles, and she never asked for a handout from anyone. The family, they soon had to go on welfare, but as the years went on, the weight of the responsibility continued to tear away at her. Louise knew that the white people in town, they hated her, and that the men responsible for her husband's death, they were living close by. She was constantly afraid that someone would come after her and her children. Even though her fears were completely justified, she was diagnosed as paranoid, and the local police committed her to a mental institution. Malcolm was 13 when his mother was taken away, and he and his 6 siblings were split up and sent to orphanages and foster homes. They kept in touch by writing letters to one another and swore that they would all reunite again someday. Despite all of these setbacks, Malcolm still had a lot of ambition for himself, and he never forgot the lessons that his parents taught him. In the 8th grade, he was a straight-A student and at the top of his class. He was intelligent, charismatic, and he had a passion for public speaking. When he went to high school, he joined the debate team and continued earning a 4.0 GPA. One of his teachers asked everyone what they wanted to be when they grew up, and Malcolm said that he wanted to become a lawyer. The teacher said that this was impossible, saying that black people were simply not allowed to be lawyers. His teacher further responded, "One of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. You need to think of something you can be. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" In reality, a man named Macon B had already become America's first black lawyer in the 1800s, but of course, Malcolm could not have known that. He believed his teacher was right. He was still living in foster care, and he no longer had his mother and father to encourage him. Despite being a straight-A student, he thought that as a black person there truly was no point in continuing at school. He dropped out in order to begin working and start a new life. When he was 17, Malcolm moved to New York City to live in Harlem. He got a job doing dishes at a restaurant, and his charismatic personality helped him make a lot of friends of all races. White men began to approach him, asking if he had any drugs or if he could hook them up with black girls. Since people were already making that assumption based on stereotypes, he decided that he might as well take advantage of it. This started his successful side hustle of being a pimp, a robber, a racketeer, and a drug dealer. He befriended John Elroy Sanford, a fellow dishwasher at Jimmy's Chicken Shack in Harlem who aspired to be a professional comedian. Both men had reddish hair, so Sanford was called Chicago Red after his hometown, and Little was known as Detroit Red. Years later, Sanford became famous as Red Fox. One of Little's best friends was a teenage boy who shared his first name, Malcolm Jarvis. The two of them, they hustled together, and they would go out to jazz clubs at night. They wore zoot suits and impressed the ladies with their dance moves. For a while, they were raking in a lot of money and having the time of their lives. In 1949, the two Malcolms were both dating white girls who they met at a nightclub. These girls had very rich parents, and they were bored kleptomaniacs looking for a bit of excitement. They encouraged the Malcolms to form a Bonnie and Clyde-style gang together. They would let the boys know whenever their parents' neighbors were on vacation, and then they would all go and steal from their homes together. Malcolm must have felt that he was playing a grown-up version of Robin Hood. But when the group was caught, it caused a huge outrage in the courts because of their mixed races. No one could believe that two rich white girls could have possibly been the masterminds behind the robberies, and of course their parents could afford to get them lawyers. So the girlfriends lied under oath, claiming that they didn't even know the boys and that they had been kidnapped and forced to participate in the robbery. Both Malcolms were only 20 years at the time, and they both received the maximum sentence of 8 to 10 years in prison. The women were able to walk free without any punishment. When he was in prison, Malcolm realized that many black men were totally innocent and had been falsely accused of crimes. These innocent men, they turned to God in order to cope with their fate. This made Malcolm very angry. He had become a staunch atheist because he believed that if there were truly a God, he wouldn't let black people suffer like they were suffering. He yelled at other inmates for being stupid enough to believe in God, and claims that even if he did exist, he had abandoned black people completely. An elder inmate, John Bembry, could see that he was very angry and in a lot of pain. So he told Malcolm that if he could not escape through religion, he should turn to books instead, because it could help transport his mind to other places. Malcolm took this advice and began to read every book in the prison library. For the first time in his life, he was reading Shakespeare and all of the other great works, and he truly did escape into his own mind. After being in prison for some time, one of Malcolm's brothers wrote to him explaining that his siblings had finally reunited and they were attending meetings of a group called the Nation of Islam. Malcolm wrote back that he did not believe in any god, but his brother promised him that if he started praying to Allah, he would get out of prison early. His brother sent him a book written by Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam. In his book, Elijah Muhammad wrote that black people were already going through their own version of hell on earth and that white men were their demonic oppressors. The Nation of Islam shares some of the traditional beliefs of Middle Eastern Islam, but it mostly focuses on raising the confidence of black people, saying that they were actually the superior race. He encouraged them to educate themselves, become self-sufficient, and have pride in their race. This was basically the way that Malcolm had been raised by his parents, and it was clear that Elijah Muhammad's teachings paralleled those of Marcus Garvey. Malcolm decided to give the Nation of Islam a chance, even though he had never set foot in a mosque before. He started to grow his beard, refused to eat pork, and prayed to Allah several times a day. The prison guards, they tried to stop him, so he wrote to the governor demanding that, as an American citizen, he should have the right to choose his religion. So part of Elijah Muhammad's teachings was to stop trying to please or integrate into white society and take pride in being an African American. So Malcolm dropped his last name Little, which was given to his ancestors when they were slaves, as a sign of ownership. He had no idea what his family's real African tribal name had been, so he decided to replace it with a simple X, representing the missing family history that had been stolen from him. He later wrote, "For me, my X replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my paternal forebears." Now that he went by Malcolm X, he started a debate team in the prison, and men would go to listen to him speak. He was such an amazing speaker that several other men were convinced to join the Nation of Islam, and they began to pray together. Instead of being meek and subservient to the white guards, they stood tall and suddenly seemed far more confident and powerful than ever before. This made the prison guards nervous. They thought that Malcolm X might have too much control, and that if he was released, he would incite riots and start a race war. The warden notified the FBI, and he was placed on a watch list and denied parole, despite his good behavior. He was finally released from prison after 6 years, and he immediately became a minister for the Nation of Islam in Detroit, Michigan. He was so good at speaking that he was given the position of national spokesman. When he first got started, Elijah Muhammad only had managed to gather 500 members into the Nation of Islam in the United States in 1952, but once Malcolm X toured and gave speeches, it quickly grew to over 30,000 members by 1963. Malcolm X was constantly trying to build up the confidence of African American people. He encouraged black people to feel proud of their natural hair and their dark skin, and never tried to compare themselves to white people. He encouraged them to open their own businesses. In Harlem, barbershops, butchers, restaurants, and clothing stores owned by black people sprang up for the very first time in American history. This sparked a trend across the nation, and black businesses they became commonplace in all major cities. It was at this point that Malcolm X met and fell in love with a woman named Betty Sanders, and the two they got married. They would go on to have 6 daughters together. Malcolm started a fraternity group called the Fruit of Islam. These were men who were like a private militia. They were always clean-cut and wore brand new suits with pride. They were disciplined, and he taught them to never use violence unless it was in self-defense. After all, peaceful civil rights protesters were being hosed down, beaten by police, and attacked by guard dogs. He believed that if they wanted to get things done successfully, they needed to prepare for the possibility that if they began to fight for their rights, it might cause a war between black and white people. The Fruit of Islam, they were taught never to attack first, but they should not accept a beating without fighting back. On April 26, 1957, one of the members of their congregation, Johnson X Hinton, was taking suits out of his car in front of the Muslim temple in New York City. Police officers saw this, and they accused Hinton of stealing the suits. When he tried to explain that they belonged to the congregation, they beat him with heavy clubs and detained him in the police station without giving him medical attention. Malcolm X, he rushed to the police station and asked to see Johnson. When they told him to leave, he told the officers to look out of the window. A line of men wearing crisp suits, sunglasses, and fedoras were all standing out on the streets. It was an entire army of the Fruit of Islam, ready for Malcolm's orders. When they finally agreed to let him see Johnson, Malcolm demanded that they call an ambulance because he was bleeding heavily and dying of his injuries. The militia followed them all the way to the hospital. When it was confirmed that Johnson would survive, Malcolm waved his hand and the militia dispersed, preventing what would have been a massive riot. This terrified the NYPD, and it was clear that even though they had no idea who he was until that day, he was a very powerful man in New York City. One officer was quoted as saying, "No man should have that much power." He later tried to sue the city to pay for Hinton's medical expenses, but they denied everything. Malcolm X decided to travel across the country and convert new people to the Nation of Islam. They eventually opened a Muslim temple in Los Angeles. In 1962, an almost identical situation happened all over again. A man named Ronald Stokes was taking the dry cleaning out of a car in front of the mosque. The police accused him of stealing the suits, and when he tried to explain, he put his hands up and they began shooting him at close range. 11 men rushed to help their friends and tried to pull the police officers away, but they were all arrested and they were all accused of being part of a so-called mob. In the local newspaper, it was printed that this was a Muslim riot. In court, the police officer who shot and killed Ronald Stokes admitted that he knew that Stokes was unarmed, but that he shot him first because he raised his hands in a menacing way. In just 25 minutes, the white jury decided that this was enough justification to murder him, and the officer, he was set free. Immediately after this man got away with murder, 11 members of Nation of Islam were found guilty of assaulting a police officer, and they were all sent to prison. After this incident, Malcolm X realized that the fight was too much for even the Nation of Islam to handle. He called for all black people to come together, regardless of their religion, in order to fight for civil rights. Following Stokes' death, Malcolm X gave one of his most famous speeches. "We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not just civil rights, but human rights. So the only way we are going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us is to come together against a common enemy." For years, Malcolm X was the face of the Nation of Islam, and even though he was spreading the teachings of his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, the man rarely did any of the work himself. Once a month, Malcolm would visit Chicago to give money to Muhammad for his living expenses. One day, he ran into 3 young women who were knocking on Muhammad's door. They were demanding that he give them money for food and child support. He learned from them that Elijah Muhammad had cheated on his wife and had 8 children with 6 different secretaries. The girls were all only 16 or 17 years old at the time, so this was also statutory rape. He was not taking responsibility for his kids, and he had ruined the lives of these young women. Malcolm asked Elijah's son Wallace if this was actually true, and he admitted that he and his mother knew, but they were in denial. The followers were so blindly faithful to Elijah Muhammad that even when the word spread that the founder of the religion was a liar and a hypocrite, they accused Wallace of lying about his father. Muhammad confirmed the rumors in 1963, attempting to justify his behavior by referring to precedents set by biblical prophets. Malcolm X did not leave Nation of Islam right away, though, but he did distance himself. He focused more on preaching about the civil rights movement. For a time, he thought that he had been tricked into living a lie. Since he was struggling with his Muslim faith, Malcolm X took a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia in 1964. He was shocked to see people of all races making the pilgrimage together. Elijah Muhammad was teaching that white people were evil, but once Malcolm saw what true Islam was like, he knew this was proof that brotherhood amongst the human race could exist. He'd seen it with his own eyes. He no longer believed that Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching a pipe dream. He was inspired to give himself a new name, el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz. He spent an additional 3 weeks traveling around to several countries in Africa. When he returned to the United States, he was a completely changed man. He no longer preached that white men were devils, and he said that all people needed to come together and live in peace. On March 8, 1964, he announced that he was leaving the Nation of Islam, and he exposed all of the corruption that he had kept secret until then. He compared the religion to a mafia crime ring that he no longer wanted to be a part of. He said that if anyone wanted to follow him, he was going to start up his own Muslim group called Mosque Inc. This was a huge threat to Elijah Muhammad's livelihood, of course, and it put a target on Malcolm's back.
Are you not, perhaps, afraid of what might happen to you as a result of making these revelations?
Oh, yes. I probably am a dead man already.
Malcolm received death threats, but he kept moving and began traveling with a newfound motivation to bring peace to all nations. He became an international diplomat and traveled to 14 African countries, meeting with 11 heads of state. He wanted to discuss the treatment of African Americans and the human rights issues that they were facing in America. He encouraged the United Nations to step in to help black people in the United States, since he believed that the American government were not doing enough to support the rights of black people. The FBI and CIA, they were following him wherever he went, and he was receiving harassing phone calls on a daily basis. Elijah Muhammad told Boston minister Louis X, later known as Louis Farrakhan, that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off, and the April 10th edition of Muhammad Speaks featured a cartoon depicting Malcolm X's bouncing severed head. His house in New York, it was later firebombed, and his wife and daughters were very nearly killed. Malcolm X publicly announced that he knew Elijah Muhammad had ordered a hit on his life and that he was going to die soon. Unfortunately, he was right. In 1965, Malcolm X was giving a speech in New York City when a member of the Nation of Islam shot him in the chest at close range with a sawed-off shotgun. 2 other men fired semi-automatic handguns. He had 21 gunshot wounds on his body. He was 39 years old. Actor and activist Ossie Davis delivered the eulogy, describing Malcolm X as our shining black prince who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so. Malcolm X was only just beginning his new goal of attempting to change the lives of African Americans everywhere, and there is no way of knowing just how much he would have accomplished if he was given that chance. Before his death, he had admitted that he had made a mistake by preaching hate against white people when he first got started, and he was ready and willing to go along with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. If he were still alive today, there is no telling just how much more he would have accomplished. Even in his short time on Earth, he inspired African Americans to be the people proud of their skin color. Because of him, black people everywhere began to demand more for themselves and from the expectations of everyone in their country. No matter what religion someone is subscribed to, they can still find inspiration from listening to his speeches about human rights. And whether they know it or not, there is so much in American society that would have never existed without the influence of Malcolm X. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this several days a week. Also, if you're looking for something else to watch right now, why not check out another channel of mine called Today I Found Out. You find that link to below. And as always, thank you for watching.